After 18 years of dedication, my father made my nephew CEO. Then everything fell apart. I worked for my father's company for 18 years. 18 long years of dedication, sacrifice, and loyalty. I wasn't just some employee punching a clock and waiting for the weekend. I lived and breathed that business. I built relationships with clients, managed a team, and took on responsibilities that weren't even in my job description because I knew, at least I thought I knew, that one day I would be the one running it. It wasn't just a job, it was my future. Growing up, my dad was my role model. He built the company from the ground up, a real self-made success story. He'd tell me stories about the early days, how he worked 70-hour weeks, how he took out a second mortgage on our house to keep the company afloat in the beginning. He was proud of what he had built, and I was proud to be his son. I admired him, respected him, and more than anything, I wanted to prove to him that I was worthy of carrying on his legacy. So, I did everything right. I started working there fresh out of high school. While my friends were partying in college, I was working 18-hour shifts, learning every single aspect of the business from the ground up. I started at the bottom, just like my dad always said was the best way to learn. I was the one sweeping the floors, handling inventory, making deliveries. Whatever needed to be done, I did it. I never complained, never asked for special treatment. Over the years, I worked my way up, proving myself at every step. By my late 20s, I was managing entire projects. By my early 30s, I was basically running the day-to-day operations while my dad focused on the big picture. Clients trusted me. Employees respected me. The business was thriving, and I knew, deep down I knew, that my dad was proud of me, even if he never said it outright. But then, everything changed. About a year ago, my dad started pulling back from the business. He was getting older, talking more and more about retirement. Naturally, I assumed that meant he was getting ready to pass the torch to me. I was his right-hand man, his most dedicated employee, his son. It only made sense. And then, out of nowhere, he announced that he was selling the company. Just like that. No discussion, no warning. One day we were sitting in a meeting, and the next, he was telling the entire staff that he had found a buyer and that the deal was almost finalized. I was blindsided. At first, I thought maybe he was selling it to me, that he had found a way to transfer ownership without it being a direct handoff. But no. It was an outsider, someone I had never even heard of before. A complete stranger was going to take over the company I had given my entire adult life to. I confronted my dad that night. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger and disbelief. He just sighed like this was some minor inconvenience he had to deal with. "I didn't think I had to, son. It's my company. My decision." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Dad, I've worked here for 18 years. I've given everything to this business. You always told me I'd take over one day." He shook his head. "I never promised you that, Brandon." Maybe he was right. Maybe he never explicitly said the words. But he didn't have to. It was implied in everything he did, in everything I did. Why else would I have sacrificed so much? Why else would I have put in all those extra hours, taken on all that extra responsibility? I felt betrayed. But it got worse. A few days later, I found out who the buyer really was. Not some random businessman, not a corporation looking to expand. No. It was my dad's longtime golfing buddy, a guy named Richard. A man who had never worked a day in this business, who had no experience running a company like ours. And the kicker? My dad had sold it to him for way less than it was worth. I was furious. I demanded to know why he would sell out everything we had built for pennies on the dollar to a guy who didn't deserve it. His answer? "I just want to enjoy retirement, son." Richard made things easy. No hassle, no negotiations. I just wanted out. That was it. My 18 years of loyalty, my blood, sweat, and tears, none of it mattered. He just wanted out. I quit the same day. I couldn't stay and work for a man who had taken away everything I had worked for. I walked out with nothing but my pride, and even that felt like it was hanging by a thread. Since then, I've had to start over. I'm building something of my own now. It's small, but it's mine. I don't speak to my dad much these days, not because I hate him, but because I just don't know how to look at him the same way anymore. I thought loyalty meant something. Turns out, I was wrong. For 18 years, I gave everything to my father's company. I sacrificed my time, my energy, and my personal life to prove my loyalty and dedication. I built relationships with clients, managed teams, handled crises, and put in more hours than anyone else. I believed that one day, all of that hard work would pay off and that I would take over as CEO when my father stepped down. It was never something we sat down and formally discussed, but it was always understood. I was the one who had been groomed for this, the one who had carried the company on my back for nearly 2 decades. Then, on my father's 70th birthday, everything changed. It was supposed to be a celebration, a gathering of family, friends, and longtime business associates to honor the man who had built our company from the ground up. I had spent weeks helping plan the event, making sure every detail was perfect. It was held at one of the most expensive venues in the city, with catered food, live music, and speeches from people who had worked with my father over the years. Everyone was there, from employees to industry leaders, and I was ready to finally hear the words I had been waiting for my whole life. I knew my father was planning to make an announcement that night. He had hinted at it for months, saying it was time for him to step back and let the next generation take over. I had no reason to believe that anyone other than me would be named as the new CEO. I had put in the time, I had proven myself, and I had earned it. But then, as I stood there with a glass of champagne in my hand, smiling as my father stepped up to the microphone, my entire world came crashing down. "Tonight, I want to take a moment to talk about the future of this company," he said, his voice strong and confident. "For years, I have built something that I am incredibly proud of, but no man can run a business forever. It is time for new leadership, for fresh energy, and for the next generation to take us into the future." I stood a little taller, feeling the weight of that moment, preparing myself for what I had always known would come next. "And so, I am proud to announce that the next CEO of our company will be my grandson, Travis." The room erupted in applause, but I did not hear it. Everything around me blurred, the sound of clapping and murmurs fading into a dull roar as I processed what I had just heard. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. Travis, my 25-year-old nephew, a kid who had just graduated from business school, who had never worked a single real day in his life, who had never had to fight for anything. He was the one my father had chosen. I could not move. I could not breathe. I watched as my father motioned for Travis to join him on stage, the young man beaming as he shook my father's hand and took the microphone. "I am honored," Travis said, his voice full of excitement. "I know I have big shoes to fill, but I am ready to take on this challenge. I am grateful to my grandfather for believing in me and for seeing my potential. I promise to lead this company with passion and innovation." The crowd cheered. My family clapped, and I stood there, frozen, feeling the weight of 18 years of hard work and sacrifice crash down on me in an instant. I turned to look at my father, searching for some kind of explanation, some sign that this was some kind of mistake, but he would not even meet my eyes. Later that night, after the speeches had been given and the celebration continued, I finally pulled him aside. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper but filled with anger and disbelief. He sighed, as if this conversation was something he had been expecting but did not want to have. "Brandon, you have done a lot for this company, and I respect that. But Travis is young and promising. He has fresh ideas, a modern perspective. The business world is changing, and we need someone who can lead us into the future." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "I have been here for 18 years. I have given everything to this company. And you are telling me that none of that matters because Travis is young?" My father placed a hand on my shoulder, but I shrugged it off. "It is not personal, son," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Not personal. How could it not be personal? I had spent my entire life believing that my work, my loyalty, and my sacrifices meant something. I had assumed that if I did everything right, I would get what I had earned. But in the end, it was not about my dedication or my experience. It was about my father choosing the easier option, the shinier, newer version of what he thought leadership should be." I left the party that night feeling hollow. Travis was surrounded by well-wishers, shaking hands and smiling, already slipping into the role that I had worked for my entire life. And I was just another employee, another man in the company, no different than the hundreds of others who had put in their time and would never see the top. I had lost my chance. I had lost everything. The night my father announced that my 25-year-old nephew Travis would be the next CEO of the company I had dedicated 18 years of my life to, something inside me broke. I had spent nearly 2/3 of my life believing that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself, if I sacrificed everything, I would eventually take my rightful place at the head of the company. But none of that mattered. My father made his decision without consulting me, without warning me, without considering the years of effort I had put in. The moment he said Travis's name, I knew my time there was over. For the rest of the evening, I moved through the crowd like a ghost, shaking hands, forcing small talk, listening to people congratulate my nephew while my world crumbled around me. My parents tried to act as though everything was normal, as if this was just another milestone in the family business, something to be celebrated. but I felt like I had been punched in the gut, humiliated in front of the very people I had spent nearly 2 decades proving myself to. I could not sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying my father's words over and over in my head. Young and promising. Fresh energy. The future of the company. None of it had anything to do with me, with my years of dedication, with the sacrifices I had made. My father had made his choice, and I was not part of it. The next morning, I walked into my office, closed the door, and sat there for what felt like hours, just staring at the desk that had once felt like my stepping stone to something greater. The framed photos of my family, the awards I had earned, the notes from employees thanking me for my leadership, all of it suddenly felt meaningless. I could not stay. I could not work for a man who had never led a team, who had never managed a single project, who had never faced the difficult decisions that came with real leadership. Travis had no idea what it meant to run a company. He had never built anything, never struggled through the long hours, never felt the weight of responsibility that I had carried for nearly 2 decades. And yet, he was the one my father had chosen. When I told my parents I was leaving, my mother was the first to react. "Brandon, you cannot make such a rash decision," she said, her voice pleading. "This company has been your life. You belong here." I shook my head. I belonged here when I believed that my work mattered. When I believed that I had a future here. But that was a lie. My father remained silent at first, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed. "I know this is hard for you, but you are overreacting. You have an important role here. You do not have to be CEO to make a difference." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Dad, do you even hear yourself? You spent my entire life preparing me for something you never intended to give me. You let me believe that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself, I would take over one day. And now you expect me to just accept this." "This is not personal," he said, but I could hear the frustration in his voice. "Of course it is," I shot back. "How could it not be? You did not even tell me. You did not even give me the courtesy of a conversation before making this decision. You blindsided me in front of everyone." My mother reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "Brandon, please," she whispered. "This company is our family's legacy. Do not throw that away." But that was the thing. It was not my legacy anymore. I had spent 18 years building something I thought was mine, something I believed I had earned. But it was never about my work, my loyalty, or my sacrifice. My father had made it clear that blood meant more than experience, that youth and potential mattered more than dedication and results. I looked at them, at the 2 people who had raised me, who had once been my greatest supporters. I wanted to believe that they had simply made a mistake, that they would see the unfairness of it all and make it right. But deep down, I knew that would never happen. So, I walked away. I handed in my resignation that same day. I did not wait for them to talk me out of it, did not give them the chance to convince me to stay in a position that would never be more than an afterthought. I had spent too many years waiting for something that was never going to happen. I refused to waste another day. My father did not try to stop me. He simply nodded, as if he had expected this all along, as if my decision did not matter. My mother cried, but she did not understand. She never would. As I packed up my office, I felt a strange sense of relief. I was angry, yes. I was hurt beyond words. But for the first time in years, I was free. Free from the expectations, the empty promises, the illusion of a future that had never truly been mine. I walked out of that building with nothing but a box of my belongings and the weight of betrayal sitting heavy in my chest. I did not just leave a job that day. I left a lifetime of believing that loyalty would be rewarded. And I left behind the family business that had never truly been mine. After I walked away from the family business, I did my best to move on, but I could not stop myself from watching what happened next. Even though I had cut ties, part of me still cared. I had spent 18 years building that company, pouring my time, energy, and effort into making it successful. I wanted to believe that, despite everything, it would continue to thrive. But deep down, I knew that Travis was not capable of leading it. At first, the changes seemed small, the kind that most people would not notice unless they had been there for years. But I noticed. Travis wanted to make his mark immediately, and he did it in the worst way possible. Within his first few months as CEO, he fired 10 of the company's key employees. These were not just regular staff members. They were the backbone of the business, the people who had been there through every challenge and had built relationships with the company's most important clients. When I heard about it, I could not believe it. These were people who had dedicated years to making the company what it was, and he let them go as if they were disposable. But the worst part was the contracts. Travis had no experience, no understanding of how the business actually worked, And yet he decided to make sweeping changes to more than half of the company's contract. He renegotiated deals, pushed for higher rates without any real strategy, and in some cases, flat out refused to honor agreements that had been in place for years. Clients started leaving. One by one, the company's most valuable customers began pulling out, looking for more stable, reliable business partners. Within a year, the company had lost more than 70% of its clients. I heard about it from former employees, people who had once been my colleagues, people who had been there as long as I had. They reached out, some angry, some desperate, some just needing to vent about how bad things had gotten. They told me that contracts were falling apart, that employees were demoralized, that the company's reputation was being destroyed. And then, the fraud. I do not know if Travis thought he was being smart, or if he simply believed he was untouchable. He started moving money around, shifting funds between accounts, inflating numbers to make it look like the company was doing better than it actually was. He approved expenses that made no sense, funneled money into projects that never existed, and covered it all up with manipulated reports. But fraud leaves a paper trail. It did not take long before people started asking questions. Auditors were called in. A full-scale financial review began, uncovering the massive discrepancies in the company's record. The numbers did not add up. Then came the lawsuit. Clients who had been misled filed claims. Investors who had been given falsified reports started legal proceedings. The financial fraud had led to a multi-million-dollar disaster, and suddenly, the company that had once been thriving was collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. I watched from a distance as everything fell apart. And my parents? They still tried to justify it. "It is just a rough patch," my mother said when I finally spoke to her about it. "Travis is young. He just needs time to adjust." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. "He has destroyed everything," I told her. "He fired the wrong people, lost the company's biggest clients, and now he is under investigation for fraud. There is no coming back from this." My father, always stubborn, refused to admit the truth. "It is not as bad as it looks. Every business has setbacks." I laughed, shaking my head. "Setbacks? You call multi-million-dollar lawsuits and a full-scale audit a setback." But they would not listen. Even as the company crumbled, even as employees left in droves, even as the name they had spent decades building was dragged through the mud, they still defended Travis. They still refused to see what was right in front of them. The company was dying, and they were still trying to pretend that everything was fine. After watching my father's company collapse under Travis's leadership, I knew I had a choice. I could let the betrayal and loss consume me, or I could take everything I had learned over the past 18 years and build something better. I chose the latter. Starting a new business was not easy, but I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I was not going to make the same mistakes my father had made. I was not going to let arrogance or blind loyalty dictate decisions. I wanted to create a company that valued experience, respected hard work, and treated both employees and clients as partners rather than stepping stones. At first, I thought I would be doing this alone, but I was wrong. The moment word got out that I was starting something new, former employees from my father's company began reaching out. People who had been fired by Travis, people who had left because they could see the writing on the wall, people who still believed in the work we had built together, they all wanted in. These were some of the most talented and dedicated professionals I had ever worked with, and they had no hesitation about joining me. Then, the clients started calling. One by one, former clients who had left my father's company because of Travis's reckless leadership started reaching out to me directly. They told me they missed the reliability, the professionalism, and the integrity they had come to expect when I was running things. They asked if I would be willing to work with them again, and I did not hesitate. Within weeks, I had a team. Within 2 months, I had contracts lined up with major clients who had no interest in going back to the disaster that my father's company had become. And within 4 months, my new business was generating more revenue than the company I had spent 18 years building for my father. I had rebuilt everything I had lost, but this time, it was mine. No broken promises, no illusions, no waiting for someone else's approval. Just hard work, the right people, and a commitment to doing things the right way. I did not need my father's business. I built my own, and I did it better. 1 year after I walked away from my father's company, it was barely recognizable. The business that had once been a thriving, respected name in the industry was now a disaster. The reckless decisions Travis had made, the financial fraud he had committed, and the mass exodus of clients had left the company on the brink of collapse. Employees who had been there for years were either fired or had left voluntarily, unwilling to work for someone who had no idea what he was doing. The financial damage was devastating. With more than 70% of their client base gone and multiple lawsuits pending, my parents were running out of options. They tried to cut costs, but the damage had already been done. Contracts had been broken, partnerships had been destroyed, and their reputation had taken a hit so severe that no amount of damage control could fix it. Eventually, they were left with no choice. After months of financial losses, they were forced to sell the company's headquarters for $12 million. The building that had once been a symbol of my father's success, the place where I had spent 18 years of my life working toward a future I thought was mine, was now gone. And through it all, Travis continued to prove just how incompetent he was. Instead of stepping up, instead of acknowledging his failures and trying to make things right, he doubled down on his mistake. He surrounded himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear, ignored advice from those who actually understood how the business worked, and blamed everyone but himself for the company's downfall. And somehow, my sister Emma still defended him. She refused to acknowledge the reality that was right in front of her. No matter how many clients left, no matter how much money the company lost, no matter how obvious it became that Travis had no business running anything, she stood by him. She argued that he just needed more time, that people were being too hard on him, that he was still learning. But learning did not excuse fraud. Learning did not bring back clients. Learning did not change the fact that he had single-handedly driven a successful business into the ground. Then, one day, my parents showed up at my office. I had not seen them in months, and the last time we spoke, they had still been defending their decision to hand the company over to Travis. But now, standing in front of me, they looked different. My father, always so confident, looked tired. My mother, who had spent the past year pretending that everything was fine, looked like she had finally run out of excuses. They asked me to come back and save the company. I let their words hang in the air for a long moment, letting them feel the weight of what they were asking. The same people who had told me that my experience did not matter, that my years of dedication meant nothing compared to the promise of youth, were now asking me to fix the mess they had created. A year ago, I had been nothing more than an afterthought to them. Now I was their last hope. When my parents came to my office asking me to return and save the company, I did not react right away. I let their request hang in the air, letting them sit with the weight of their own words. For a year, they had defended their decision, dismissed my hard work, and ignored everything I had built. Now, when their business was in ruins, when they had no other options, they had finally come back to me. I looked at my father, the man I had once admired, the man I had spent nearly 2 decades trying to make proud. He looked older, more tired than I had ever seen him. My mother stood beside him, her eyes filled with silent desperation, as if she knew this conversation would not go the way they wanted. I took a deep breath and told them no. I reminded them that this was their choice. They had decided to trust Travis over me. They had watched as he fired key employees, lost major clients, and destroyed everything that had taken years to build. They had ignored every warning sign, dismissed every concern, and refused to listen when people told them that the company was being driven into the ground. Now, after all of that, they expected me to fix it. I shook my head and told them I had moved on. I had built something better, something that was mine, something that I did not have to beg for or fight to keep. My new business had already surpassed their company in revenue, and I was working with people who actually valued my leadership. I was no longer the person who had spent years waiting for my father's approval. I no longer needed it. My father sighed, rubbing a hand over his face as if he had known deep down that this was coming. My mother tried again, pleading with me to reconsider, telling me that family should come first. I reminded her that family had not come first when they had made their decision. They had chosen loyalty to an idea over loyalty to me. I told them I wished them well, but I was not going to be their backup plan. They left without another word. A few weeks later, I received a letter from my father. It was long, carefully written, and filled with words that I had never expected to hear from him. He admitted that he had made a mistake. He told me that he had let his pride blind him to the reality of the situation and that he had chosen the wrong person to lead the company. He said he regretted not seeing my worth until it was too late. For a long time, I stared at the letter, waiting for the anger to return, for the resentment to rise up again. But it never did. I had moved on. I no longer needed validation from my father, no longer needed his approval or his acknowledgement of what I had always known to be true. I was not angry anymore, but I had no desire to return to the past. I had built something new, something strong, something I could be proud of. After I refused to return to the company and fix the mess Travis had created, I thought that would be the end of it. I had moved on, built something better, and made it clear that I was not interested in going back. But my family was not ready to let go. They could not accept that I had not only walked away from them but had also thrived without them. Emma, who had defended Travis from the beginning, was the first to strike. She tried to sue me, accusing me of stealing clients from my father's company, claiming that my success was built on deception and unethical business practices. It was a desperate attempt to regain control, to force me into a battle that I wanted no part of. But she failed. The lawsuit was weak from the start, based on nothing but bitterness and frustration. Clients had come to me willingly, reaching out on their own, looking for the stability and reliability that my father's company could no longer provide. There was no deception, no underhanded tactics, just a simple truth. People wanted to work with me because they trusted me. The case was dismissed quickly, but the damage was already done. Not to me but to them. The lawsuit only proved how desperate they had become, how much they had lost, and how unwilling they were to take responsibility for their own mistakes. Then, in a last-ditch effort, my parents showed up at my office one final time. They had already pleaded with me once before, but now, with no other options left, they had returned. My mother tried to soften the moment, speaking of family and second chances, saying that it was not too late to put things back together. My father, who had already admitted his mistake in writing, stood beside her in silence, his expression unreadable. I did not let them sit down. I did not offer them coffee or entertain the illusion that this conversation would end any differently than the last one. I asked them why they were really there. I told them I had already given them my answer, that I had no interest in saving something that was beyond repair. And that was when I saw it, the truth that had been there all along but had taken me years to fully understand. They were not grieving the loss of me. They were grieving the loss of control over me. For years, I had been the son who worked tirelessly for their approval, who sacrificed everything in the hope that my loyalty would be rewarded. But now I was no longer under their influence. I had built my own success, my own business, my own future, and they had no say in it. That was what they could not accept. I watched as my mother's face fell, as my father's shoulders slumped in quiet resignation. They had nothing left to say. Without another word, they turned and walked out of my office for the last time. I did not watch them leave. I had already moved on. Time has a way of revealing the truth, and as the months passed, everything that had once seemed uncertain became crystal clear. My business was thriving beyond anything I had ever imagined. The team I had built, the clients who had trusted me, and the work I had poured my energy into had all paid off in ways I never thought possible. For the first time in my life, I was not chasing anyone's approval. I was not waiting for recognition from people who had never truly valued me. I was building something that was mine, something I had full control over, something that no one could take away from me. Through it all, my wife stood by me, supporting me in ways that my own family never had. She believed in me when I had nothing, when I had walked away from the only career I had ever known, when I had to start from scratch. Now, as we stood on the other side of everything, I could finally see what real loyalty looked like. Meanwhile, the people who had once dismissed me, betrayed me, and cast me aside were facing the consequences of their own choices. Travis had driven my father's company into complete financial ruin. The lawsuits, the fraud, the loss of clients, it had all caught up to him. The business was beyond saving, and there was no one left to bail him out. Emma, who had defended him until the very end, had nothing left either. She had fought to keep the illusion alive, had even tried to bring me down with a lawsuit that never had a chance. Now she was just as bankrupt as he was. And my parents? They lost everything. The company they had spent 40 years building was gone. The reputation they had worked so hard to maintain was destroyed. Their financial security, their standing in the industry, their legacy, it all crumbled under the weight of their own mistake. They had chosen the wrong person to trust. They had ignored the warnings, refused to listen, and convinced themselves that they were making the right decision. But in the end, reality caught up to them. As for me, I felt something I had never truly felt before. I felt free. I was no longer the son waiting for a seat at the table. I was the man who had built his own. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be.